In 2026, something unusual is happening in the world of computing. Something that most mainstream users are only starting to notice, but Linux enthusiasts have been watching unfold for years. The balance of power in desktop operating systems is quietly shifting, not through a single dramatic event, but through a series of small changes that are now adding up to something much bigger than anyone expected. For decades, Windows dominated personal computing. macOS built a strong ecosystem for creators and professionals, and Linux stayed mostly in the background powering servers, developers, and tech enthusiasts. But now, for the first time in a long time, a Linux distribution is beginning to feel less like an alternative and more like a real mainstream competitor, and that shift is what many are calling the beginning of a new era. The reason so many users are suddenly paying attention to Linux in 2026 is not just about ideology or curiosity anymore. It is about practicality. Over the last few years, users have become more frustrated with increasing system requirements, forced updates, privacy concerns, subscription-based software models, and hardware limitations on traditional operating systems. At the same time, Linux distributions have become dramatically easier to install, more visually polished, and far more compatible with modern hardware and applications than ever before. What used to require technical skill can now be done in minutes with a clean installer, a guided setup, and a user interface that feels familiar even to someone switching from Windows for the first time. Among all the Linux distributions gaining attention, there is one that keeps appearing in discussions, forums, and tech reviews as the most likely candidate to become the next big Linux OS. It is not necessarily because it is the most powerful or the most customizable, but because it strikes a rare balance between simplicity, performance, and user experience. It manages to feel modern without overwhelming the user, powerful without being complicated, and familiar without copying anything too directly. This combination is exactly what has been missing in the Linux desktop space for years. What makes this shift even more interesting is the type of users who are switching. In the past, Linux adoption was mostly limited to developers, engineers, or users who enjoyed tweaking their systems. But now, everyday users are making the jump. Students, freelancers, gamers, content creators, and even small businesses are experimenting with Linux in ways that would have been uncommon just a few years ago. The motivation is not just curiosity, but frustration with the increasing complexity and restrictions in other operating systems. One of the biggest drivers of this movement is performance. Modern computers are powerful, but many users feel that their systems are slower than they should be. Background processes, telemetry, heavy antivirus software, and pre-installed applications often consume resources without users even realizing it. Linux, on the other hand, tends to be lighter by design. Even a well-optimized modern Linux distribution can run smoothly on older hardware, breathing new life into laptops and desktops that were considered outdated by Windows 11 or newer macOS versions. This alone has encouraged millions of users to experiment with Linux as a secondary or even primary operating system. But performance alone is not enough to explain the sudden rise in popularity. The real breakthrough has been usability. For years, Linux suffered from a reputation problem. It was seen as powerful but difficult, flexible but unfriendly, capable but inconsistent. That perception is changing rapidly. Modern Linux distributions now come with polished graphical interfaces, app stores that feel as smooth as mobile ecosystems, automatic driver installation, and seamless support for common hardware like printers, Bluetooth devices, and graphics cards. Users no longer need to spend hours searching forums to get basic things working. In many cases, everything just works out of the box. Gaming has also played a surprisingly important role in this transition. A few years ago, gaming on Linux was considered niche and unreliable. Today, thanks to major compatibility layers and industry support, thousands of Windows games run smoothly on Linux systems with near-native performance in many cases. This has opened the door for a large wave of gamers who were previously locked into one ecosystem. When users realize they can play their favorite games without losing performance, the hesitation to switch begins to disappear quickly. At the same time, developers have also started shifting their workflows toward Linux more aggressively. Cloud computing, containerization, and open-source development tools have made Linux not just a preference, but often the most practical environment for modern software development. As more developers use Linux professionally, they influence the tools, documentation, and communities around them, making Linux even more accessible for newcomers. This creates a cycle where improved usability attracts more users, and more users further improve the ecosystem. Another major factor behind the rise of this next big Linux OS is privacy awareness. Over the last decade, users have become increasingly concerned about how much data their operating systems collect. Background tracking, advertising integration, and cloud synchronization have become standard in many mainstream platforms. Linux distributions, especially community-driven ones, tend to offer more transparency and control over data. Users can choose what runs on their system, what connects to the internet, and what gets installed. This sense of control is becoming a major selling point in 2026. However, what truly makes this new wave different is not just technical improvement, but emotional experience. People do not just want an operating system that works. They want one that feels good to use. This includes smooth animations, clean design, consistent themes, and a sense of coherence across applications. Modern Linux distributions are now investing heavily in design systems that rival commercial operating systems. The result is an experience that feels less like a tool and more like a polished environment where users actually enjoy spending time. There's also a cultural shift happening within the Linux community itself. In the past, Linux communities were often divided between highly technical users and beginners who struggled to find support. Today, the community is becoming more welcoming and structured. Documentation is improving, forums are more beginner-friendly, and developers are actively focusing on onboarding new users rather than just building for experts. This cultural change is just as important as the technical improvements because it determines whether new users stay or leave after trying Linux for the first time. As we move deeper into 2026, one of the most discussed ideas is whether a single Linux distribution could eventually break into mainstream consumer markets in the same way Android did for mobile devices. While Linux already dominates servers and cloud infrastructure, the desktop space has always been fragmented. Hundreds of distributions exist, each with different goals, philosophies, and user bases. This fragmentation has historically been both a strength and a weakness. It allows freedom and innovation, but it also confuses new users who are unsure which version to choose, the next big Linux OS. Narrative is not necessarily about eliminating this diversity, but about one distribution emerging as a clear entry point for the majority of users. A system that does not require deep technical knowledge, does not overwhelm users with choices, and does not sacrifice flexibility for simplicity. Instead, it offers a smooth onboarding experience while still allowing advanced users to dig deeper if they want to. This balance is extremely difficult to achieve, but it is exactly what is needed for mainstream adoption. Another reason this shift is happening now is hardware evolution. Modern processors, GPUs, and laptops are becoming more standardized in terms of Linux support. Manufacturers are increasingly collaborating with Linux developers to ensure compatibility at launch. This reduces one of the biggest historical barriers to adoption, which was driver issues. When users install Linux today, they are far less likely to encounter the hardware problems that were common a decade ago. In addition, software distribution has become much more unified. App ecosystems like containerized packages and universal software formats allow developers to ship applications that run consistently across different Linux systems. This reduces dependency problems and makes software installation much closer to the simplicity users expect from modern platforms. Instead of manually resolving dependencies, users can install applications with a single click or command, and everything is handled in the background. As all of these improvements come together, the perception of Linux is changing from alternative operating system to serious mainstream option. But the most interesting part is that this change is not being driven by marketing campaigns or corporate pressure. It is being driven by users themselves. People are actively choosing Linux because it better fits their needs, not because they are being pushed toward it. Looking at the future, the question is not whether Linux will grow, but how fast it will continue to evolve, and whether it can maintain this momentum without losing its core identity. If a single distribution manages to become the primary gateway for new users, it could redefine how personal computing works. It could challenge long-standing assumptions about operating systems, software ownership, and user control. But even if no single distribution dominates completely, the influence of this movement is already undeniable. The improvements made in Linux over the last few years are pushing the entire industry forward. Competing operating systems are also adapting, adding more customization options, improving performance, and responding to user demands for privacy and control. In that sense, Linux is not just growing as a platform. It is reshaping expectations across the entire computing world. The idea of millions switching is not an exaggeration anymore. It reflects a broader trend where users are actively exploring alternatives and realizing that they are not locked into a single ecosystem. Once that realization spreads widely, the barriers to switching become much lower. People begin to experiment, try dual boot setups, run Linux on secondary machines, and gradually transition their workflows. For many, the switch becomes permanent once they discover that they are not losing anything essential. What makes this moment in 2026 so significant is that it feels like a tipping point. All the long-term development work, community effort, and incremental improvements are finally converging. Linux is no longer just catching up. In some areas, it is beginning to lead. Whether it is performance efficiency, customization, or transparency, it offers advantages that are becoming harder to ignore. The next big Linux OS is not just a piece of software. It represents a philosophy of computing where users have more control, systems are more efficient, and technology feels less restrictive. That philosophy is resonating more strongly now than ever before. As digital life becomes more central to everything people do, the operating system they choose matters more than it used to. And so, as 2026 continues to unfold, the question is no longer whether Linux has a place in the future of computing. The real question is how big that place will become and how quickly the rest of the world will catch up to what is already happening quietly beneath the surface.